whenever you're ready, Annette.
So I have to say this all probably started when last semester I got the great opportunity to help design a video game with a bunch of people. This is actually it here up on the screen. It was called No Time, and it was a basic trivia game that was timed, and I was the sole programmer of the game. And so after what must have been about 3 weeks of amazingly hard work, we produced a very good game, and as the sole programmer, I suddenly became very, very aware of any mechanics that were built into video games. To the point where not only was I aware of it, but I was aware of the fact that while they were immensely important to video games as a whole, I really hadn't been thinking about them during the years that I had been playing video games. And so I was wondering how this affected the concept of mechanics as a whole, and in fact how this was affecting the conversation about video games as a whole. The fact that these unnoticed mechanics were just kind of working in the background, but no one seemed to be talking about them. So that led me to my research question of how do mechanics in the chat box within World of Warcraft influence player communication? Now, I focused on World of Warcraft for a couple of different reasons. The first one was simply personal. It was one of the first largest video games that I started playing. The second reason is within the video game industry, World of Warcraft is immensely important. It's been around for years now, and in the concept of video games, it's like basically the great-grandparents of video games. And it's also huge. At one point, it had over 12 million users. And even though there will be one day where World of Warcraft is not being played by gamers all around the world, it's already had a massive effect upon the industry because World of Warcraft has proved what things work and what things don't work. So if World of Warcraft does something, everyone else is paying attention. The reason I chose the chat box in particular was because I was personally interested in player communication. And so are many different researchers. When I was first starting my analysis, I found many different papers that have already been written about how players are communicating, what they're communicating about, what problems they're having communicating. But once again, I found the fact that mechanics were just kind of being ignored. While they were a basic concept that everyone seemed to understand, that video games needed mechanics, no one seemed to be asking what these mechanics were actually doing for the game. Now, before I get much farther, I should actually lay the groundwork of what a mechanic is. A mechanic is how something is done, not what is being done. So for instance, if you're having a hard time visualizing this within a digital context, I want you to think of the concept of dice. What is being done with dice is it allows the player to do something within the context of numbers. For instance, many times dice are used to move players across the board. But how it's being done is the player takes the dice and they roll them and then they count the number of dots that are on the top panels of the dice. That's the mechanic. And then what the mechanic allows the player to do is, move, or whatever ability they want, the designers of the game wanted the players to be able to do with that mechanic. So, how does this fit within World of Warcraft? So this is a screenshot I took myself, and in fact in the center there you can see my character. And over here to the left-hand side is the chat box. It's this permanent box here, and this appears every time you come to this gameplay screen, and you can't get rid of it. And then also open here, I just have some different commands, which I'll come back to later. But this is just what you need to be visualizing while I'm talking about through the rest of my presentation. So the first thing I noticed when I began my analyzing this was that there were certain mechanics which were permanent, as in they were procedures going on within the game that I, as a gamer, had no influence on at all. And this was actually rather interesting for me to notice because as a gamer, I'm used to the game wanting constant feedback for me because a video game is a very interactive process for the gamer in the game. However, there were many mechanics going on, even within just the chat box, that were able to go throughout the game that didn't need any help from me at all. For instance, the chat box itself. It comes up whether I as a gamer like it or not every time I start the game. It stays there whether I as a gamer want it there or not. And I don't actually have many options when it comes to the chat box itself. For instance, I can't change the size, I can't change the actual color of the chat box, even though I do have some options with color when it comes to the text. I can't move it around like if I wanted it on a different side of the screen. And I came to the conclusion that permanent mechanics exists because without them, the game literally could not function. There is no World of Warcraft without the chat box. And what I mean by that is the permanent mechanics are what creates like the walls of the game. If the game itself was a building, or just the room that we're standing in right now. We cannot visualize the game without these mechanics. And to further prove myself to this, I simply Google searched World of Warcraft without a chat box, and I came up with one hit. And I did a couple of different versions of this, and I came up with maybe one, maybe 2 hits each time. This is very interesting for me because, first of all, gamers themselves, I've always felt, have been very creative people, and if something is not working for them, they'll fix it. So this means that all of the World of Warcraft players online are not even thinking about a World of Warcraft without a chat box. It's not coming to their mind. They can't visualize it, because to visualize it, they are no longer playing World of Warcraft. They're playing a completely different game, because this mechanic is necessary to contextualize the game as a whole. The second thing I noticed was that there were mechanics that I could change, but they all had a default setting, so therefore they came into existence and started working without any prompting from me whatsoever. However, if I felt one of these automatic mechanics were not working, I did have the option to change it, unlike the permanent mechanics. And I feel that this was happening because with automatic mechanics, they want to be permanent mechanics unless they're not working, and they're getting in the way of the player, whether it's through getting in the way of the player's agency or interrupting the flow of the game for the player, or the player feels that they could go farther without this particular mechanic. And so they set it up without any prompting from the player, but if the mechanic itself is not working enough that the player notices the mechanic, they have the option to change it. I can give you an example, and I can come back to the screen really quick. When it comes to channels, because this was the most interesting automatic mechanic that I noticed. Now, the channels themselves that I'm going to talk about are actually showing up here. I know you probably can't read those pink words, but what they say is general, trade, local defense, and looking for group. Now, a channel is actually how the players can communicate within the chat box itself. The chat box is basically the box sitting there, and the channels are all the different places within the chat box that players can talk to each other. Players have the option to sign up to a channel, and until you sign into a channel, you don't see what's being said within that channel, and you are not able to message within that channel. And so when you actually send a message within a chat box, it's not appearing in the chat box, it's appearing in one of those channels, and you have to pick which one you want it to appear in. So general, trade, local defense, and looking for group are the channels that World of Warcraft automatically signs you up for. Now you have the option of signing up for more channels, or if you don't want the automatic channels, you can sign off of them so you don't have to see the information that's being put on there in your feed anymore. But if, for instance, you don't understand the concept that channels can be changed, or maybe if you're not noticing the looking for group or the trade channel, they'll just stay there and continue to work as if they're a permanent mechanic that the player cannot change. That's because unless it's getting in your way, World of Warcraft wants you to have these channels here because they feel it's an essential part of your game. And finally, there were the player mechanics that actually involved direct communication from me. Think of the rolling of the dice. Now this was actually what gave me as a player agency within the context of the game, but even the constraints put upon these player mechanics had their own arguments to be made. For instance, I quickly realized that one question I always came up with when I was playing was whether I wanted to talk or I wanted to move. That was because to be able to type a message on the chat box, I had to stop moving as a player, because to move around the digital space, I had to be using the keyboard as well. So after this analysis, this was the conclusion that I came to, that through the mechanic, an argument is made that contextualizes what the mechanic allows to be done. And so at the end of this, you may be asking, so what? The one thing that I noticed as a programmer is that a good mechanic is an unnoticed mechanic, because it's not, a mechanic is not there to be its own self, it's there to be a part of you. And so therefore, if it's an unnoticed mechanic, it's also an unnoticed argument, and an argument that the designers are trying to make a part of the player. And I think that's a very important thing you want to notice if you're just studying anything about video games. Any questions?
What questions do we have for our speaker? How does your analysis of the chat box, what does it offer to players as well as non-players?
I think it allows them to actually fully participate within a conversation that they're technically already having. Because that was the most interesting thing I noticed about mechanics, is that they're built to be an extension of the gamer. They're not built to be their own part of the game itself. And so therefore, these arguments that I found when I was looking at permanent mechanics, automatic mechanics, player mechanics, were technically parts of conversations that I was already having, but I wasn't really noticing. For instance, the keyboard was one of the things I found the most fascinating, was that it was very interesting that they set up two mechanics to technically work against each other. And so therefore, if you were moving, you were not typing. And what I always came back to was that, well, what if this was just something that they didn't notice? But then I always thought about the fact that World of Warcraft is a multi-million-dollar video game that has been running for years, and these are two of their core mechanics. If they decided this was creating gameplay and creating a video game world that they did not want, they would have changed it. And so therefore, I felt the designers were doing this for a specific reason. And the gamers themselves were just allowing this to happen, even though they were that was technically motivating their decisions within the game player world in such a way that they may not actually be aware of. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because if a player constantly had to be thinking about every single thing that they were doing, it really would be hard to play the game itself and focus on the things that they had chosen mattered to them within the gameplay world. But then again, if they didn't have any awareness of it at all, the designers themselves could actually be making a lot of different arguments that the gamers themselves didn't necessarily agree with.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, thank you so much.
Question for you guys, actually. I know none of you play video games, but as non-gamers, could you follow what I was saying? No, that's totally okay. There's a difference between not playing World of Warcraft and not necessarily caring about video games and having, like, okay, no clue what this crazy lady up the front of the room is saying.
So how does it apply to these folks who, a lot of them don't play World of Warcraft?
Well, I think it applies on many different levels, because the concept of playing a game was not created by video games itself, and the concept of play and simply gaming as a culture has been around for years. I mean, I've seen games that we no longer play that were created in the Middle Ages. And these concepts of mechanics, and this part of this larger concept, which is something called procedural rhetoric, which is something I've become very interested in, does appear outside of games. We have procedures within our daily lives. Now, procedures are slightly different than mechanics, because a mechanic is defined and set to always work, while a procedure is a much more fluid concept of this may set up to be worked only once, and then it may immediately be dropped. However, this concept that procedures have their own rhetorical arguments, I think, also applies as well. And so therefore, my argument about the fact that you may be participating in a procedure that is making its own argument that you may not necessarily notice can also apply to real life as well. However, I wanted to start studying it within video games because mechanics are much more solid than procedures, and so having a better understanding of this concept, it was easier to start off with mechanics, and and than it was to start off with procedures. And I'd eventually like to get to procedural rhetoric and have a better understanding of what arguments they're making, but that's not the step that I'm at yet.
Well, thank you so much. Can we give a round of applause?